This is the GiantMouse Ace Tribeca. And it's showing a serious evolution of GiantMouse's design, though it's still got some of the quirks they tend to bring to the picture. I generally review knives in 5 steps. First, we're going to go through some specs, size, price, things like that. Then we're going to talk about what I like, what I don't like, fit, finish, and value, and then end with some concluding thoughts. Trying to make the best use of your time that I can and make this so that this is the only review you have to watch about this knife to know whether you want to get it or not. Let's get to it. This is the GiantMouse Ace Tribeca. This design came out in 2022 or 2023. It's from GiantMouse's Ace line, which is their line of high-volume production knives. These knives are made in the hundreds to thousands, not their GM line, which is their more sort of select. Those are still production knives, but those are made in the hundreds. This one here is, I think it's still, no, the Biblio XL came out more recently now. So as of the time I'm recording this, this is one of their newer designs. It came out in multiple micartas, G10, titanium. Now it's come out in a couple different anodizations of titanium. This version here is the G10 version. This is a $215 knife from most retailers. And it has a 2.95 inch blade here, 7.2 ounces or 7.2 inches for the whole thing. It is, there we go, CPM Magna Cut on the blade, which GiantMouse has been using in most of their more recent designs. And it is 4 ounces, which is a little bit on the heavier side. Some quick size comparisons. The closest one is your Para 3. This is almost exactly a Para 3 size knife. Similarly, if I take out my native here, this is very similar in size, if anything, a little bit bigger than your native. If I take out my large Sebenza here, you can see it is smaller than your large Sebenza, while being larger than your small Sebenza. Just a little bit more thicker than your small Sebenza, than larger. It's about the same length, but it's definitely a thicker, definitely a bigger knife than if I compare it to your PM2. You can see quite a bit smaller than your PM2. But really, the easiest way to think about this is if you've had a Para 3, this is a Para 3 size knife. Albeit, excuse that noise, with thinner blade stock. That's the biggest difference here. Now, GiantMouse crowned their spine, so it's a bit hard to see. But you can see significantly thinner blade stock and significantly, well, not necessarily thinner overall in the sense that at the thickest the scales are about the same, but these scales are contoured compared to the flat scales of the Para 3. So this knife feels thinner than the Para 3, even though it's actually about the same thickness. So those are your specifications. Oh, and this one is, I want to say it's made in Italy. I'm pretty sure this is one of the GiantMouse that is made in Italy. I'll come back and correct that if this is one of their China ones, but it certainly feels like they're made in Italy models. Oh, and it is a liner lock here. And it has both a opening hole here and a flipper. And like most of their knives like this, especially these days, it runs on bearings. Okay. What do I like about this knife? Excuse me, 3 things that I like about it. First off, these handles are very nicely done, and they're a significant upgrade over what GiantMouse used to do. If we look at these handles, they are very nicely contoured. I love the way this G10 ends up looking. I really thought this was micarta. Even the person that sold it to me said it was G10, but I had to look at pictures online to see that, nope, the G10, the way they contour it gets this wood grain look on it that is just really, really nice. And it's a pretty aggressive contour with a chamfer all the way around. And as is typical for GiantMouse, the ergonomics are fantastic. That contour, so relatively neutral design, especially compared to a lot of GiantMouse's more aggressive designs. But you've got your front finger choil right here, which is definitely a full finger choil. You've got a space right here for your middle finger, big finger notch there. And then it's pretty neutral, albeit somewhat downward sweeping behind that. You got GiantMouse's typical jimping in the middle of the blade for your thumb, lands right there. This grip, especially with the contouring that just rolls into your palm, super, super secure. Very, very comfortable in this grip. This is the grip you're primarily going to be using this knife in. Honestly, doesn't feel that great in a fully choked back grip where you're not using that choil. And every time I've tried to cut it like this, stuff gets into this choil all the time. Like, it's very hard to cut using this knife and not fall into the choil. So honestly, think about this as a single grip knife where you're choking up on that choil. You're right on top of the blade. You have so much control over this blade here. And it's just ergonomically very, very nice in the hand. Good design. The contouring really helps. Well executed. Nicely knocked down everywhere. It's just, it's what GiantMouse tends to do very well, which is that they have ergonomically exceptional knives. And one of the things I'm also going to point out is if you compare this to the Biblio, which is sort of its closest prior, you can see there's a lot of general similarities in how these knives look. You can see how much more refined the handle design is on the Tribeca compared to the Biblio. The contouring is a little bit more aggressive, a little bit just more subtle. The chamfers are slanted a little bit more, and most importantly, your liners are nested, so this thing isn't nearly as much of a chunk in the pocket. The fact is, these are, if anything, the Tribeca is a little bit larger of a knife than your Biblio, but it feels a little bit smaller in the pocket than the Biblio, and that's because the way that they nested these liners, the way that they contoured those scales, it's just, it ends up being a little bit thinner, but feeling much thinner in the pocket, despite being about the same size. So it really, the design of these handle scales reflects the evolution of GiantMouse's design methodology and their manufacturing methodology. Is just a more refined knife. The second thing that I really love about this knife to a surprising degree is this blade. Very high. Technically, this is a drop point. You can see that that point does drop a little bit. This is a very Vox design. It's a short, stubby blade with tons of space to drop down to the edge. But, I mean, this is basically, the tip is pretty much on the line. Well, I guess, no, it swoops down enough. It ends up being about on the line of the pivot when you think about how you actually grab it. But this huge belly here, this thing is amazing for extended cuts. Like when you're cutting through cardboard, or like when you're cutting through plant material. This huge continuous belly with this relatively high tip and just a bit of drop that it gives you. This thing is so easy to, like I'm using it in the garden, so easy to just get into whatever I'm cutting and just slice through it continuously. This thing is a cardboard monster. It will go through cardboard like few other knives I have, because this big belly here just continuously passes through whatever you're cutting through. It stays in the cut very easily, very naturally. Again, when you're choked up. When you're choked back, stuff will fall into the choil all the time. But when you're choked up, this thing just stays in the cut so nicely for your long slicing cuts. You know, with these high tips and big bellies, it's not going to be the best knife for like down on a table, stuff like that, for your quote-unquote utility cuts. But for either the stuff that you would tend to do outdoors or the stuff that you tend to do in harder use chores, things like that, this ends up being a really, really good knife. It's also got a very good grind on it. 12,000 or 120,000, so relatively thin blade stock, all considered, but it keeps that thickness most of the way out. So you've got a relatively tough blade. And on top of that, it's Magna Cut steel, so it's honestly as tough as you will ever need. It is a blade that you can beat on. But then it's got so much space to drop down to this edge here that it ends up being quite thin behind the edge. And in terms of how it feels in use, it feels much slicier and much more keen behind the edge than a lot of GiantMouse knives tend to. This was more of a joy to cut with. It reminded me in that sense of what I got from the Biblio, which is one of GiantMouse's very best knives in that regard. This thing is very, very thin behind the edge, very, very slicey. The sheep's foot blade shape helps there. This has a lot of that same DNA, and then it's got a short stubby blade and lots of space to drop. And that just leads to a very good user blade. This is a great user, and in fact these blades end up being quite complementary, where the Biblio is really, really good at those utility tasks that you're, cutting down on a table, dragging the tip through a box, cutting twine, things like that. Stuff where you want lots of control over that tip. It struggles a little bit more in those long extended cuts just because the belly's a little bit more subtle. The Tribeca here is amazing at the cuts where the Biblio struggles a little bit, and struggles a little bit in the cuts where the Biblio does really well. So they end up complementing each other very nicely. But for a lot of those harder use tasks, this ends up being about as good at those bigger, heavier duty tasks as a 3-inch knife can be. It feels very much like and in some cases even a lot better than the Para 3 in that regard. You can see it's got even more belly than the Para 3 and has that same feeling of being a relatively small knife that can really punch above its weight, especially given how good those ergonomics are. And the other thing that is good about this knife with a big caveat is the action. And the caveat is that the action is very good as a thumb flicker or a slow roller. This thing, once you get past the detent, which is a little bit late. Oh, okay. It's been a dropper for a while for me. I guess I've just usually been slamming it shut like that. But more than the action on the drop, these are very smooth bearings. It flicks out very nicely. They knock down the opening hole just enough that you can still catch your thumb on there. I do wish, theoretically, I wish this opening hole was a little bit further out, because then it would be a little bit easier to get into. You do kind of have to crane your thumb in a little bit. It's not really a problem, but they couldn't do that. If they did that, it would be doing a Spyderco thing where you got the hump here. It would expand the whole profile of the knife, so they didn't do it for that reason. But it flicks out, thumb flicks very easily, very securely, very satisfying. Slow rolls very nicely. You don't feel any resistance on the bearings. And then it's a nice, about as sort of hydraulic as bearings can feel, sort of close, where it's not really a drop shutter, but it is very smooth the whole way. Very smooth, very even. Again, in a way a lot of GiantMouse knives tend to not feel. We'll talk about that flipper tab later, as that is not a pro. But the action is done very nicely here. It's very satisfying to open, very satisfying to close, satisfying to fidget with. And when you've got that fidget factor, it's not something that I put a lot of value on, but it's very nice when it's there. And it makes it feel a little bit more high-end. However, there are two primary things, and I think I'll just leave it to those two things that I really don't love about this knife. And the first, because we're there, let's talk about this flipper tab. And there's a caveat on this because I understand why it's designed the way it is. This flipper tab sucks. It is curved away from where you're pushing on it. It's got some relatively ineffective jimping on it. And basically, you have to pull so aggressively back and not push button this. I got it to go, but it's hard. This is a hard flipper tab to actuate. It's not pleasant to actuate. Now, there's a reason. We've got a reverse hinderer situation here. You know, hinderers, in fact, I've got a hinderer for this. So hinderers, everybody complains about how this thing is hooky. It's hooked the opposite direction of the Tribeca. Anybody, like people who know hinderer, know the reason it's hooked like that is because it's meant to make this front guard here, and it's primarily a finger guard and a flipper tab second. GiantMouse has done the opposite with the Tribeca. The primary purpose of this is to follow the line of this front finger groove here and to form this front finger choil here. And it does a great job. This is a really, really good finger choil. It's nicely knocked down. It's really comfortable to put your finger in there, which is great because, again, this is the primary grip you'll be using this knife in. And that is why it is curved back there and then curved, comes to that low point there. because it was, you can tell, it was basically designed first to do what it needed to in this position here, where it's open and forming these two finger grooves, which are essential to the ergonomics of the knife. And it just so happens that it ends up sticking out the back and being a flipper tab. That's the way that I think about this. I don't really see this as a flipper tab. You can use it as a flipper tab. If you really like flippers, it'll work, especially once you get used to it. You can see I'm flipping it just fine here. But this is so much more satisfying as a thumb opener or a slow roller, and you can Spidey flick it. I suck at Spidey flicking, and I can still manage to Spidey flick this well. So if you're looking, excuse me, if you're looking at this as a flipper, there you go. I'm finally missing on camera. Don't. The flipper tab's not great. The second thing, which is a bit more of a substantial issue, is the weight. So I mentioned before, this is a small knife that feels like a big knife in terms of how useful it is. And most of that goes to, it's because of the blade, because of how well the blade's designed, and also, frankly, because of how well the ergonomics are designed in that primary choked up position. The negative way it feels like a big knife is this is way heavier than it needs to be. 4 ounces for a sub 3-inch blade with in a G10 liner lock. That was acceptable back when the Biblio V1 was coming out, which is about the same weight. But these days in 2024, this feels heavy. And frankly, when I look in here, yes, they finally started nesting the liners, which is great. But there's no milling on these liners. Excuse me. It just feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. And on top of it, not only is this knife heavier than it should be, it feels handle heavy as a result. With not that thick blade stock and full liners that are not milled out at all, this thing, it feels like most of the weight is in the handle. That's actually really good when you push this into those harder tasks. It feels very secure in the hand. And I'm guessing because GiantMouse tends to do that in so many of their knives, that's probably partially deliberate, and they are maximizing for, excuse me, the ergonomic experience in the hand, where being a little bit more handle heavy can be helpful. But that does mean, especially because this is so small, the thing is 4 ounces not heavy, but 4 ounce in a knife this small feels dense. This feels like carrying a rock in your pocket, in the sense that even though it's not a big knife, you feel it swinging around. You feel it taking up that space in a way that you don't even for some knives that are larger but lighter. And so, while I've loved using this knife, I haven't found myself carrying it nearly as much as a lot of other small knives, and a lot of it does come down to that weight. It's just the way that GiantMouse seems to choose to do things. They prioritize that experience in the hand, and they compromise on the experience in the pocket. But that does mean that in a very competitive world of pocket knives in 2024, it does mean that it feels a little unrefined. It almost feels like they're cutting a corner a little bit, even though I can't say for sure that the reason they didn't mill those out was cost savings. And by the way, I'm making all those comments on the G10 version. The micarta version is about the same weight. The titanium versions of this knife are like 5.1 or 5.2 ounces, which is ridiculous. That's literally like about the same weight as my XM18 here for a sub 3-inch knife. And that's ridiculous. So this knife would be better served to be lighter. I don't think it would compromise the ergonomics that much. It would feel more premium, and it would just be more enjoyable to carry. It's my biggest issue with the Tribeca. And honestly, it was an issue that was very clear from the first time I picked it up. I knew looking at the specs that this looked like a heavy knife. And then the second that I picked it up the very first time, it was obvious. It was like, yes, this thing is heavier than it looks, and it's a bit of a bummer because the cutting experience is so good. Fit, finish, and value. $215. Made in, again, I'm 90% sure this one is made in Italy. If it's not made in Italy, then it's made by either Riot or Best Tech, likely in China. GiantMouse has stepped up their value proposition very significantly over the last couple of years. I talked about this in other videos. The way they used to make knives like the Biblio, this thing is about the same price as the Tribeca. And you can see, just looking at these two knives on the table, how much more refined the Tribeca looks than the Biblio. The Biblio, great design, ergonomically superb. But the blade finish is a little unrefined, takes on fingerprints and stuff like that, like mad. The edges aren't really knocked down. The scales are just fat and chunky. I mean, the term that you would use over and over again with the Biblio is unrefined. Great design, unrefined. They've started to do a lot more of those refinement touches in the Tribeca. Instead of a machine satin, you've got a really nice stone wash on this blade, which also means you've knocked down this opening hole here. You've nicely crowned the spine. This jimping, their jimping remains extremely well placed and very effective. At least it's very effective here. Again, on this flipper tab, it's not really steep enough to do much there, but the flipper tab's a lost cause probably. Very nice plunge. Again, a fantastic bit of rounding on that finger choil. Makes it super comfortable. Nice, even grind. The handle scales I've already mentioned. The contouring on this G10 is fantastic. The way they get sort of that wood finish almost out of G10 is not like anything that I've seen before. The liners, while I can bitch about them not being milled out, they're nicely nested. You've got pretty good liner lock access here. I've never had an issue with it. Your hardware is nicely, it's not flush, but it's not meant to be flush. It's flush at the edges and then domed outside of it. Feels nice, fits with the contouring. Your other hardware, again, is just a little bit beyond flush, but is rounded off so it doesn't feel like it's sticking out. A very nice backspacer. I believe this one is actual brass, not brass anodized titanium, which again makes the darn thing heavier. But it's nicely finished. GiantMouse's backspacers are cool, and they give you a lanyard hole in a way that doesn't stick out in the design. It's integrated as a design feature. The fit and finish of this knife is very good. For $215, it's not a value, especially made overseas. Though for an Italian-made knife, $215 is not that expensive. It's not a value, but it's also not ripping your face off. It doesn't feel expensive. It doesn't feel cheap. If anything, it feels maybe a little bit on the expensive side, and it feels more on the expensive side to me for the titanium versions, which can easily creep up to pretty close to the $300 mark. But if you like the design, and if you want a knife of this type, you're going to be fine with the $215 that you pay for it. And on the secondary market, these modern GiantMouses hold their value pretty well. This is probably a $150, $160 knife on the secondary market in good condition. So fit and finish value is all fine and a very significant improvement over what GiantMouse used to be. You're not getting the level of precision and refinement you get from somewhere like Spyderco or even Benchmade in that same price range, but it's not an issue anymore. It's not a downside. And so that brings us to, that brings us to our final conclusions. Very good knife with, unfortunately, like a lot of GiantMouse knives, a couple issues that are more frustrating than I would like. This blade is really, really good. This is one of the best blades that GiantMouse has. Lost some data coming back here for the final conclusions on the Ace Tribeca here, and it's an awesome knife. It reflects the best of GiantMouse's design evolution. You're seeing a much more refined profile, a much more refined design here. You're seeing fantastic ergonomics in the hand. You're seeing a very useful and utilitarian blade shape that is ground nicely. You're seeing some very nice fit and finish here. You're seeing a very premium looking and premium feeling knife that happens to still be very useful, and you're getting it in this G10 version at a accessible price point at $215. These days, that is a pretty accessible price point. The flipper tab, don't come into this thinking that it's a flipper. You're going to be disappointed. And I'm still a little chapped by how heavy it is. This is still a knife that could have been significantly lighter than it ended up being. That makes me carry it a lot less than I otherwise would. That's going to be a problem for some people. It's not going to be for other people. If you want a premium looking, premium feeling EDC, this is a very solid option, especially for those sort of more, not your utility chores, not your, box cutter sort of stuff, but stuff like your housework, stuff like some of your garden work, things like that, where this blade shape is really going to shine. This is a great choice. And especially if you're a fan of GiantMouse's ergonomics in general, this is really showing where the brand is evolving into a more premium feeling and premium looking space. And that's the GiantMouse Ace Tribeca. Overall, it is a recommendable knife. And if you like this profile, or if you're even curious about it, or if you've handled some of Voxnaze's other designs, whether it's through some of the urban EDC supply designs that they've done, that they've had made overseas. I mean, this one is made overseas as well. Whether you've had some of his work with ClarkeTheKnife, whether you've had some of his other work somewhere else, this is a great option to sort of see and feel some of the things that make Jesper Voxnaze's designs so good. Recommendable knife, check it out. Hope this was a good use of your time. And I hope to see you again soon.